Okay, so have you ever, like, I don't know, held a brand new book? You get that, like, that smell of the paper almost. It's just different. And then you see those little newspaper stands on the corner and, they're getting smaller. Or you see an old printing shop with one of those going out of business signs and you think, huh, is that the end of, like, print and stuff?
Yeah, it's a question that's been like floating around for years now, right?
Totally. And today we're diving into a place where the answer is surprisingly complicated. Malaysia's printing industry. We want to figure out if print really is fading away or if there's something else going on, especially in a place like Malaysia with such a fast-growing economy. We found some really interesting data from the Department of Statistics Malaysia, and we also got to hear directly from people working in the thick of it all through some pretty insightful interviews.
Right. And what we found is that even with all the talk about print dying out, the Malaysian printing industry has actually been incredibly resilient.
Like a cockroach you just can't kill.
Well, sort of. If you look at the numbers from 2019 to the middle of 2022, there's definitely a story there full of ups and downs,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's one of survival.
So in 2019, things started off pretty strong. There was a 4.2% growth, which isn't too shabby at all. But then wham, 2020 rolls around and throws that pandemic curveball at everybody.
Yeah.
And the industry takes a 4.6% hit. But, and here's where I think it gets really interesting. Remember how the whole global economy basically went a little, crazy?
Absolutely. Everything was totally out of whack.
Right. And a lot of people thought that would be it for print. Lights out, game over.
Yeah. A lot of folks thought that was the final nail in the coffin.
But the Malaysian printing industry actually kind of mirrored the country's economic recovery. So as Malaysia's GDP started bouncing back, so did print.
Yeah, it wasn't a straight shot back to the top or anything. It was a bumpy ride.
Sure.
But by the second quarter of 2022, things were looking up. Printing was booming, hitting a record 11.5% growth.
That's incredible. Talk about a comeback story. But it's not like every single part of the industry was, popping champagne and celebrating.
No, not at all. I mean, the industry overall showed it could bounce back, but some parts of it were definitely facing some serious uphill battles, especially those tied to traditional advertising.
Yeah, like newspapers.
Exactly. Newspapers got hit hard. Back in 2012, they were raking it in, controlling a whopping 42% of advertising spending in Malaysia.
Wow.
Flash forward to 2022, and that number plummets to a measly 7%. And it's a similar story with magazines, too.
It's like everyone suddenly decided to ditch their newspapers and magazines and just scroll on their phones instead. And you can't talk about Malaysia without talking about how much they love their internet and smartphones, right? Everyone and their grandma is online. So naturally, businesses are following the eyeballs, shifting their ad money to those digital platforms where they can reach way more people.
Exactly. It's like marketing 101, right?
Totally.
But here's the thing. This is a global trend, not just something specific to Malaysia. It's a perfect example of how technology just completely reshapes an entire industry. However, and this is where things get really interesting, there's a bit of a plot twist.
It's true. You've got this whole rise and fall thing happening, and just when you think it can't get any wilder, bam, a global pandemic drops in. You'd think that would be it, the end for an industry that was already struggling to keep up with the times.
Right. How much more can they take?
Exactly. But here's the thing. While the pandemic definitely wasn't easy for Malaysian printers, it actually kind of breathed new life into some parts of the industry. It's like they say necessity is the mother of invention, right?
100%.
Yeah.
This is where we see just how crucial adaptability and innovation really are.
It's like the printing industry got thrown into a wave pool and had to learn how to surf just to stay afloat. So let's talk about Malaysia specifically. We know from those interviews that Malaysian printing companies were hit with a lot of challenges all at once.
Oh, for sure. They had to deal with increased costs, demand for certain products just drying up, huge disruptions to their operations. Not to mention all the uncertainty about what the future even holds.
It's about a recipe for disaster, right?
It's a wonder any of them survived at all, honestly.
So let's break it down. One of the biggest hurdles was obviously the cost factor, right? The pandemic brought a whole bunch of new health and safety rules, like having to provide PPE for everyone, constantly sanitizing everything, and trying to figure out social distancing in a factory. All of that stuff costs money, and not a small amount either.
Right, and that's on top of their already existing costs. It's a huge burden for any business, let alone one that's already facing an uphill battle.
It's like adding insult to injury. And then, on top of all that, the demand for some of their biggest products completely tanks. We already talked about what happened with advertising, but it wasn't just that. Some companies had government contracts for things like printing textbooks, and even those got delayed or canceled.
Yeah, the ripple effect was huge. And then there was the whole logistical nightmare to deal with.
Oh, right, like trying to run a factory when you've got lockdowns and restrictions on movement.
Exactly. Factories had to cut back on how much they were producing, and some even had to close their doors temporarily.
Wow. So not only were they dealing with higher costs and less demand, but they couldn't even operate normally.
Right, it was one thing after another. On top of that, supply chains were completely disrupted, so even getting the raw materials they needed to print anything became a huge challenge.
It's honestly amazing that any printing got done at all. Malaysian printing companies must have had to get really creative just to keep their businesses alive. So how did they do it? What kind of strategies did they use to navigate all of that chaos?
Well, from those interviews, it seemed like most of them took a three-pronged approach to dealing with everything.
Okay, I like it. A three-pronged approach. So what was prong number one?
So, first and foremost, they focused on diversifying and innovating. They knew they couldn't just keep doing the same old thing, especially with those traditional products like brochures and flyers, not when everyone was online. So they started branching out, looking for new markets and new products.
So like what kind of things were they printing instead?
Well, some of them got into things like direct-to-garment printing, which, if you aren't familiar, basically lets you print custom designs directly onto clothing.
Oh, yeah. That's really popular now. I've seen so many people with those personalized t-shirts and hoodies.
Exactly. And it's a smart move for these printing companies because it lets them tap into a whole new customer base.
It's like taking their old printing presses and teaching them some new tricks.
Right. And for those who weren't keen on clothing, some got into canvas printing. Personalized home decor is huge right now, so it makes sense that they'd try to capitalize on that.
It's all about finding those niches, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole world of print on demand.
Oh, yeah. Print on demand is huge these days. It seems like everyone I know who sells anything online is using it.
It's a game changer, honestly.
Yep.
It's perfect for small businesses, artists, anyone who wants to sell products without having to worry about storing a ton of inventory. They can basically sell custom-designed anything. Phone cases, stationery, tote bags, you name it.
It's so smart. It's like the perfect solution for the digital age. So it's not just about printing more stuff, it's about printing smarter. But I'm guessing all of that innovation doesn't come cheap. How are they managing costs while also trying to completely reinvent themselves?
Well, that's where the second prong of their strategy came in. Cost reduction. They knew they had to tighten the belts and get really serious about managing their money.
So like no more leaving the lights on when you leave the room, that kind of thing.
Exactly. When you're in survival mode, every penny counts. They started streamlining their operations, looking for ways to be more efficient, negotiating better deals with their suppliers, and really scrutinizing every single expense.
Makes sense. You got to cut the fat where you can.
Absolutely. And then the third and arguably most important area of focus was employee health and safety.
Well, yeah, you can't run a business without employees.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about following the rules, it was about showing their employees that they valued their health and well-being. They invested in creating a safe working environment, which helped to build trust and confidence among their workforce.
Because at the end of the day, a healthy workforce is a more productive workforce.
Exactly. So they were basically hitting it from all angles, trying to cut costs, find new ways to generate revenue, and making sure their employees felt safe and valued. And you know what? It seemed to work. A lot of these companies were able to weather the storm, but they were still facing a very uncertain future.
So they're doing everything they can to adapt, becoming like the chameleons of the business world. But what did they think the future actually looked like for printing in Malaysia? Were they hopeful?
Well, those interviews, they showed an industry that's definitely at a crossroads. You know what I mean? Some parts of it are facing some really tough times ahead, while others seem like they're actually in a good spot to grow. Like, remember those pandemic all-stars we talked about? The packaging and labels? They weren't just a quick fad, it turns out.
Because everybody and their dog was ordering everything online, right? Like who was going to the store anymore?
Exactly. And all those online orders, they need boxes, labels, all that packaging stuff to keep things safe. E-commerce just keeps growing in Malaysia, so it makes sense that the demand for that kind of printing would grow too.
It's like one industry's crisis is another's golden opportunity or something. But what about those traditional parts of the industry we talked about, the newspapers and magazines? Did those interviews give us any hope for them?
Honestly, it's not looking great for traditional print media, at least not in the long term. The move to digital news was already happening, and the pandemic just kind of kicked it into high gear. A lot of people switched to reading their news online during those early lockdown days, and they never really went back to print. And it's not just news either. It's books, magazines, even those advertising flyers that used to pile up in your mailbox.
It's kind of sad in a way, isn't it? It's like, remember those huge racks of magazines at the grocery store checkout? It feels like a lifetime ago almost.
It really does. It's like a different world. But here's the thing. It's not just about what's being printed. It's about how it's being done. And that's where those Malaysian printing companies, they had some really insightful things to say. They were talking about how they're moving toward completely new ways of doing business, using technology, and really focusing on what customers actually want.
So it's less about just churning out a ton of the same product and more about like specialized, personalized service.
Exactly. Think about those websites where you can design your own business cards or wedding invitations, all online, totally customized. That's what we're talking about. Print on demand, but on a whole other level.
It's all about giving the people what they want when they want it, right?
Right. Convenience, personalization, speed. That's what people want these days, and that's what these new printing businesses are trying to deliver.
So after spending all this time digging into the Malaysian printing industry, what have we learned? What are the key takeaways here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that print is far from dead. It's not going down without a fight. But it is changing, evolving, adapting. Just like those Malaysian printing companies had to evolve and get creative to survive, the whole industry is going through a metamorphosis.
It's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, right?
It's a great way to put it. It's all about transformation. And the ones who are willing to change with the times, to try new things and find new ways of doing business, those are the ones who will make it out the other side.
It kind of reminds you that even though we live in a digital world, there's still a place for things that are tangible, things you can touch and feel. The beauty of real ink on real paper. It's not about clinging to the old ways of doing things. It's about finding that balance between tradition and innovation.
Absolutely. Print can be so much more than just a product. It can be an experience, a connection. It's a way of telling stories and building relationships in a way that just hits differently than digital.
It's true. There's just something about it. So next time you pick up a beautifully printed book or get a handwritten note on a nice piece of stationery, take a second to appreciate it. That's artistry. That's craftsmanship. And in a world that's increasingly digital, that's something worth holding on to. We might not know exactly what the future holds for print, but one thing's for sure. It's going to find a way to leave its mark.